I never thought a handful of orange survey stakes could make my stomach drop, but the morning I found them lined up along the edge of my corner lot, I knew something wasn't right. Not because anyone had called me, not because I'd received a letter, but because deep down every property owner knows what their own land is supposed to look like, and mine had suddenly started looking like it belonged to somebody else. By the end of that week, an entire neighborhood development worth hundreds of thousands of dollars would be frozen because of one legal filing. But standing there that Tuesday morning with a coffee getting cold in my hand, I had absolutely no idea how far this thing was about to go. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for almost 12 years I'd owned that little corner parcel on the edge of Brookstone Ridge, a quiet subdivision outside Cedar Falls. It wasn't a huge piece of land, just under an acre, but I'd bought it before the subdivision expanded because someday, after retirement, I planned to build a woodworking shop there. My wife used to joke that I'd spend more time designing that future shop than actually working in it. She wasn't wrong. Every spring, I'd mow the lot before the grass got too tall. Every fall, I'd clear the leaves. I'd even planted a few maple trees near the back fence because I figured one day they'd provide shade for a porch. It wasn't just vacant land to me. It was the picture I'd been carrying around in my head for over a decade. My wife passed away 3 years before all this happened, and somehow taking care of that lot became part of keeping those plans alive. People probably drove past thinking it was just another empty field, but every Saturday morning when I fired up the mower, I wasn't maintaining property. I was holding on to a future that still meant something to me. That's why those survey stakes hit me so hard. They weren't random either. They followed a clean line that cut across the front of my parcel, then curved toward the section facing the subdivision entrance. Whoever put them there knew exactly what they were doing. I walked the property twice, looking for utility markings or county flags, but there weren't any. Just fresh stakes with bright ribbon fluttering in the breeze. About 10 minutes later, my neighbor Linda came walking her golden retriever past my driveway. She smiled the way neighbors do when they assume you've already heard the news. Looks like they're finally moving ahead with the community park, she said. I frowned. Community park? She nodded. Yeah, everyone was talking about it after the HOA meeting last month. They said the corner lot would become the new gathering space. Walking paths, picnic tables, maybe a gazebo. I just stared at her. Linda, that's my corner lot. The smile disappeared from her face. Wait, what? I've owned it for almost 12 years. She blinked twice before quietly saying, Daniel, I thought they bought it from you months ago. I laughed. But it wasn't because anything was funny. It was that strange laugh your body produces when your brain refuses to accept what it just heard. Well, they definitely forgot to include me in that conversation. Linda apologized 3 different times before continuing her walk, but her words stayed with me the rest of the day. I skipped lunch and pulled out every property record I had stored in my filing cabinet. Deed, tax receipts, insurance documents, surveys, everything was exactly where it had always been. Nothing had changed. I still owned every square foot. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it made me wonder why everyone else apparently believed something completely different. That evening, I dug through the HOA newsletter archive online. Buried halfway through a PDF from 4 months earlier was a colorful rendering labeled Future Community Enhancement Project. Families walked along sidewalks. Children played near a fountain. Neighbors gathered around picnic tables. And right in the middle of the illustration sat my lot. They hadn't even disguised it. They had drawn my property into their master plan like ownership was just a minor technical detail they'd sort out later. I didn't sleep much that night. Every scenario kept running through my head. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe somebody copied the wrong parcel number. Maybe an engineering firm got careless. I wanted there to be an innocent explanation because the alternative was far worse. The next Thursday, the HOA held its monthly board meeting inside the neighborhood clubhouse. I wasn't a member because my property technically sat just outside the mandatory HOA boundary, but meetings were open to the public. About 30 residents filled the folding chairs while board president Richard Camden stood at the front beside a projector screen showing updated construction timelines. He looked polished, confident, the kind of man who always sounded like he'd already rehearsed every answer before anyone asked the question. When public comments opened, I stood up. Richard, I like to ask about the proposed park shown on the latest site plan. He smiled politely. Certainly. Why does that plan include property I legally own? A few heads turned toward me. Richard barely hesitated. Mr. Mercer, the association has always anticipated incorporating that parcel into the neighborhood's long-term vision. I frowned. Anticipated? Eventually, yes. Did I agree to sell it? His smile tightened just enough for me to notice. Those conversations happen over time. No, they don't happen over time. They either happen or they don't. We have never had one. The room became uncomfortably quiet. Richard folded his hands together. Honestly, Daniel, you should take it as a compliment. It's an important location. We believe it would greatly benefit the community. I looked directly at him. Did your board file anything with the county involving my property? He leaned back slightly and gave me a calm little grin that somehow irritated me more than if he'd yelled. Nothing you need to concern yourself with. That sentence changed everything. It wasn't what he said. It was how easily he said it, like my ownership was somehow an inconvenience standing in the way of his plans. I walked out before the meeting ended, got into my truck, and sat there for almost 5 minutes with both hands gripping the steering wheel. Then I started the engine and made myself one simple promise. If they thought I wasn't going to concern myself with my own property, they were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. Into part 1. The county administration building opened at 8 the next morning, and I was sitting in the parking lot at 7:30 with a folder full of tax receipts, surveys, and every document proving that corner lot had belonged to me since the day I bought it. I've always believed that if something doesn't make sense, paperwork usually tells the truth. People exaggerate. People forget. People lie to save themselves, but documents have a funny way of exposing everybody. The woman at the records counter couldn't have been more helpful. She looked at my parcel number, confirmed I was still the legal owner, then asked why I needed copies of the planning files connected to my property. I simply said, because I think somebody forgot to ask permission. She gave me a curious look, but printed everything I requested. About 45 minutes later, I was sitting at one of the public tables, flipping through a stack of applications, engineering drawings, environmental reviews, drainage reports, and planning documents. At first, nothing jumped out at me. Then I reached a site plan submitted almost 5 months earlier. My hands actually stopped turning the pages. There was my parcel number, not a neighboring lot, not an adjacent easement. My exact tax identification number appeared inside a shaded section labeled Future Community Green Space dedicated to Brookstone Ridge Homeowners Association. I checked it 3 times because I honestly wanted to believe I'd misread it. I hadn't. Someone had deliberately identified my property as land dedicated to the HOA, even though I had never signed a contract, never negotiated a sale, never even received a phone call. The deeper I looked, the worse it became. The engineering plans already showed walking paths crossing my property. The landscaping proposal included irrigation lines running through the middle of my lot. The lighting contractor had estimated 6 decorative lampposts. A playground supplier had quoted equipment placement only 30 feet from the maple trees I'd planted with my wife years earlier. None of this was theoretical. Contractors had submitted bids. Budget approvals had been signed. Inspection schedules were already assigned. This wasn't somebody brainstorming ideas during a board meeting. They had built an entire development plan around land they did not own. The total project budget exceeded $260,000. I leaned back in my chair and just stared at the ceiling for a second. I kept asking myself the same question. How does something like this even happen? Then another file answered it. Buried inside the application was a statement prepared by the HOA's engineering consultant describing the parcel as anticipated association control property. That phrase caught my attention immediately. Anticipated. Not owned. Not under contract. Anticipated. Somehow that single word had been enough for everyone involved to keep moving forward. The county hadn't transferred ownership because legally they couldn't, but the planning department had reviewed the proposal under the assumption that the applicant had authority to pursue the project. Nobody had actually checked whether the assumption was true. It was one of those bureaucratic blind spots where every office trusted somebody else to verify the facts. I left the courthouse carrying copies of everything and drove straight to an attorney recommended by an old friend from church. His name was Michael Grayson, and unlike the television lawyers who enjoy dramatic speeches, Michael spent most of our first meeting quietly reading. Every now and then he'd underline something, flip another page, or ask me a simple question. Did you ever authorize negotiations? No. Did you sign an option agreement? Never. Did anyone offer to purchase the parcel? Not once. Finally, he closed the folder and looked at me over the top of his glasses. Daniel, I don't think this started as someone trying to steal your property. I wasn't sure whether that should make me feel better. He continued, I think they convinced themselves they'd eventually buy it, then started acting as though they already had. The problem is the law doesn't recognize wishful thinking. That was probably the calmest way anyone could describe a disaster. I asked if we should sue immediately. He shook his head. Maybe later. Right now we have something much more effective. He explained that because my parcel had been incorporated into an active development application, filing a formal notice disputing any claimed interest connected to the land would immediately alert the county that ownership questions existed. Under state regulations, any permit relying on that parcel could be suspended until the dispute was resolved. We're not accusing anyone of fraud today, he said. We're simply forcing everyone to stop pretending uncertainty doesn't exist. I like that approach. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't revenge. It was simply putting reality back into the process. Over the next 2 days, Michael's office prepared the paperwork. They attached my deed, tax history, survey records, photographs of the maintained property, and a sworn affidavit confirming continuous ownership. On Monday morning, just after 9 o'clock, the notice was officially recorded with the county recorder, hand-delivered to the planning office, electronically forwarded to the building department, and copied to the engineering review committee. Then we waited. I tried distracting myself by cleaning my garage, but every 15 minutes I found myself looking out the window toward the construction site a few hundred yards away. Around noon, something changed. The steady beeping of heavy equipment stopped. Then the excavator engine shut down. A concrete truck pulled onto the road, paused for several minutes, then slowly turned around without unloading. Workers gathered in small circles pointing toward clipboards and phones. Within another hour, every machine sat completely still. Silence settled across the entire project. It wasn't triumphant silence. It was the kind that happens when everyone suddenly realizes somebody important has said, "Stop." My phone rang at 2:15. It was Michael. The suspension order has been issued. No construction associated with that permit can continue until ownership questions involving your parcel are resolved. I looked out my front window again. The site that had been buzzing with activity all week looked abandoned. That afternoon, rumors spread through the neighborhood faster than I thought possible. Linda called asking if I knew why construction had stopped. Another neighbor texted saying contractors were furious because crews had been sent home early. By dinner time, people were posting photos in the community Facebook group asking why expensive equipment was sitting idle. The HOA board responded with a vague statement about unexpected administrative delays, but that explanation lasted all of 30 minutes before somebody uploaded screenshot from the county website showing the permit status had officially changed to suspended. Residents immediately started asking questions the board couldn't answer. If this was only an administrative delay, why had the county frozen the entire project? Why were inspectors leaving the site? Why were subcontractors canceling deliveries? Tuesday morning, the story became even bigger. One of the landscaping companies publicly complained online that weeks of scheduling had just collapsed because somebody had failed to disclose an ownership dispute before construction began. Then, the paving contractor demanded compensation for idle equipment. Every hour the project remained suspended was costing somebody money. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, I heard a truck pull into my driveway. I looked through the front window and almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because I recognized the dark blue SUV immediately. Richard Camden stepped out wearing the same confident suit he'd worn during the board meeting, except this time there wasn't an audience watching him. He stood on my porch for several seconds before knocking. When I opened the door, the difference in his expression was impossible to miss. The polished smile was gone. The easy confidence had disappeared. He suddenly looked like a man carrying a problem far heavier than he'd expected. "Daniel, he began carefully, "I'd appreciate the chance to discuss a possible solution." I folded my arms, but didn't invite him inside. "Funny," I said. "Last week you told me I had nothing to worry about." He looked down for a moment before meeting my eyes again. "Circumstances have changed." "No," Yensuarat quietly. "The circumstances haven't changed. You just finally noticed them." He took a slow breath. "The board believes we can reach an understanding that benefits everyone." I almost smiled. A week earlier, my ownership had been treated like an inconvenience. Now, it had suddenly become the center of a $260,000 crisis. Funny how quickly respect appears when expensive machinery stops moving. Richard asked if I'd consider selling. I told him that conversation should have happened before they spent months designing a project around property they never owned. He admitted the planning process had moved faster than expected. I replied, "No, Richard, your assumptions moved faster than the law." For the first time since we'd met, he didn't have an answer. He simply asked if his attorney could contact mine. I stepped aside just enough to make one thing perfectly clear. "From this point forward, Richard, you won't be discussing my property with me. You'll be discussing it with Michael Grayson." He nodded once, climbed back into his SUV, and drove away far slower than he'd arrived. I watched him disappear down the street, knowing this story was nowhere near finished. Because once lawyers started talking, somebody on that board was going to discover exactly how expensive confidence could become. For the next 2 weeks, I hardly heard anything from the HOA, and honestly, that silence said more than any argument ever could. Michael handled every conversation while I went back to my normal routine, mowing the lot, checking on the maple trees, and watching the construction site sit completely still. Every day those idle machines reminded me that assumptions can get expensive. Then Michael called with the words I'd been waiting to hear. "They're ready to settle." We met at his office the next morning. Across the table sat Richard Camden, the HOA's attorney, and 2 board members who suddenly looked a lot less confident than they had a few weeks earlier. Their attorney admitted the association had relied on assumptions instead of verified ownership, then offered to resolve everything without going to court. Michael slid a settlement agreement across the table. The terms were simple. The HOA would remove my parcel from every current and future development plan. Record an official deed confirmation with the county acknowledging that I was the sole owner. Reimburse me $4,000 in legal fees, and agree that my property could never again appear in any proposal without my written permission. Richard quietly looked at me before signing and said, "I honestly believed we'd eventually work something out." I looked back at him and replied, "The mistake wasn't wanting to buy my land. It was acting like you already had." He didn't argue. A few days later, the county recorded the new documents. Construction resumed with revised plans, and every survey stake disappeared from my property almost overnight. Soon afterward, residents began asking uncomfortable questions about how private property had ended up inside the HOA's project in the first place. At the next election, several board members lost their seats, and Richard chose not to run again. About a month later, my neighbor Linda stopped while I was mowing the lot and smiled. "So, are you finally going to build that workshop?" I laughed. Maybe now I actually will. Standing there, looking across the same piece of ground I'd cared for all those years, I realized something. The value of that land had never been measured by what someone else wanted to build on it. It was measured by every Saturday I'd spent maintaining it, every tax payment I'd made, every plan my wife and I had dreamed up together. The HOA never physically took my property, but they almost convinced everyone else that it already belonged to them. And that's exactly why I filed that legal notice. Sometimes protecting what belongs to you isn't about money. It's about refusing to let someone else's assumptions become accepted as fact. So now I'd love to hear what you think. Was the HOA simply careless? Or do you believe they knowingly crossed the line because they assumed I wouldn't fight back? If you were in my shoes, would you have accepted the settlement or taken them all the way to court? Let me know down in the comments. I read as many of your stories as I can. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or someone who quietly acted like your property belonged to them, I'd really like to hear what happened. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.